how do you know of me?
Everyone knows who you are.
Ghost of Sparta.
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 Ghost of Sparta. Ghost of Sparta. Ghost of Sparta. Ghost of Sparta.
Ghost of Sparta. Ghost of Sparta.
Ghost of Sparta. Ghost of Sparta.
Do not call me that.
What bollocks, brother. Respectfully, bollocks.